The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm so glad that you all are here for this last session in our series with Caitlin Hubler. If you've been here before, you know that you're in for a treat. And if you're joining us today for the first time, I hope you'll pull up a seat up close so that you can be engaged in what I'm sure will be some rich discussion. Caitlin has just done an excellent job leading us through the Old Testament, a lighthearted romp through the Old Testament, as they say. And I think today we're going to spend some more time sort of synthesizing what Caitlin has taught us. So I am really grateful for this time, for your being here. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Caitlin with my thanks.
Thank you, Carmi. Thank you, Epiphany, for having me back for this final week where, as Carmi said, we try to synthesize some of what we've chatted about in the last few weeks related to idolatry in the Old Testament. I'll pray for us first. God, we're grateful for this time that we have to dig into your wisdom that you have for us as we open the pages of Scripture and also look at the world around us and discern how it is that you're working and what our role is in that. So we ask that you bring us wisdom today, that you would bring us discernment as we look into this topic of idolatry. And in your name, Lord, we pray, amen. All right, well, you can see I said to Carmi, gone for the jugular with this title. It's very ambitious. How to spot an idol according to the Old Testament. I can't promise that you will leave with a fully functioning idol radar. But I've tried to, and what I hope we can do together today is pull together some of these threads that we've looked at from different stories in the Old Testament, legal material, prophetic texts, etc., with more of an eye toward how do we discern idolatry in our current context, because we do believe that Scripture continues to speak to us today in our current context. So before we get into that, though, I want to share with you an interesting analysis of what we might call a temple of the modern day, of the modern West. And so I want you to look at this picture. I know you might think you know what it is. It might seem familiar, might be a place you've been before. But I want you to forget all of what you know about this place and listen to the description that I'm about to read to you. So you have it all in your mind, what this is? Okay. This is a passage from a philosopher named James K.A. Smith. Some of you may know him. He's amazing. But here's one of his, what he has to say about this picture. He says, as we pause to reflect on some of the icons on the outside of one of the chapels, we're thereby invited to consider what's happening within the chapel, invited to enter into the act of worship more properly, invited to taste and see. We are greeted by a welcoming acolyte who offers to shepherd us through the experience, but also has the wisdom to allow us to explore on our own terms. Sometimes we will enter cautiously, curiously, tentatively making our way through this labyrinth, within the labyrinth, having a vague sense of need but unsure of how it will be fulfilled, and so are open to surprise, to that moment when the Spirit leads us to an experience we couldn't have anticipated. Having a sense of our need, we come looking, not sure what for, but expectant, knowing that what we need must be here. And then we hit upon it. Combing through the racks, we find that experience and offering that will provide fulfillment. At other times, our worship is intentional, directed, and resolute. We have come prepared for just this moment, knowing exactly why we're here, in search of exactly what we need. In either case, after time spent focused and searching in what the faithful call the racks, with our newfound holy object in hand, we proceed to the altar, which is the consummation of worship. While acolytes and other worship assistants have helped us navigate our experience, behind the altar is the priest who presides over the consummating transaction. And this is a religion of transaction, of exchange and communion. When invited to worship here, we are not only invited to give, we are also invited to take. We don't leave this transformative experience with just good feelings or pious generalities, but rather with something concrete and tangible, with newly minted relics, as it were, that are themselves the means to the good life embodied in the icons who invited us into this participatory moment in the first place. And so we make our sacrifice, leave our donation, but in turn receive something with solidity that is wrapped in the colors and symbols of the saints and the season. Released by the priest with a benediction, we make our way out of the chapel in a kind of denouement. Not necessarily to leave, our awareness of time has been muted, but rather to continue contemplation and be invited into another chapel. Who could resist the tangible realities of the good life so abundantly and invitingly offered? So this is sort of tongue-in-cheek, as you can tell. He's obviously describing a mall with lots of different stores that one goes in. The reason I wanted to open today's session with this is I think whenever we make the move from talking about ancient idolatry to modern idolatry, it can be tempting for those of us in sort of the US context to say, oh, we don't worship a lot of strange gods, we're enlightened, we're monotheistic, we understand, the right and proper ordering of desire and of worship. But for me, what our time in the Old Testament has revealed is that there's a fundamental parity between idolatry today and idolatry in the ancient world. Because idolatry at the end of the day is more about practice than belief, and it's more about loyalty than particular presuppositions that one assents to. It's really hard, you probably feel after looking at the particular instances of idolatry in the Old Testament, it's really hard to look at any of those and simply say, oh, they had the wrong idea about who God was. That's certainly part of it, but it's much more holistic set of assumptions that you participate in related to what is goodness, what is just, what is worth pursuing. And so I think what James K.A. Smith so masterfully shows us here is he's making the familiar very strange and showing that even if these chapels might not be chapels to Baal or El or Asherah, they're still communicating a set of coherent values that at times could be in conflict with the set of values that we have through Scripture. And so, as a result, we are not more enlightened than ancient people because we don't have as many gods. In a way, it might be more difficult for us because of the disenchanted age that we live in, leading us to be blind to the ways in which we have these competing visions of loyalty. So any thoughts or reflections on that first passage that we shared?
Hard for me to get my arms around it. But.
Yeah, I might have bit off a little more than we could chew, because you could really talk a lot about the ways, the sort of modern liturgies in a way, and sort of finding these resonances between the religious world, the explicitly religious world, and the quote-unquote secular world, which, as we know, nothing's really secular. So, thank you.
And it really speaks to how consumerist our culture is, and I think that maps onto like how we think winning is about the acquisition of crap, wealth.
I think that's a
Wealth
really good point.
requires crap. So
Yeah, and that's just sort of an assumption that we hold, right? Is wealth is good. The more wealth I have, the better. And so it's something that seems neutral in the same way that maybe Jeroboam, going back to Kings, considered it natural to have worship sites that are local to his people that are living with him. It sort of is the natural way to do, but we can be uncritical about what are the assumptions about the good life or divine guidance that are embedded in that decision that seems natural. Why does it seem so natural? And so I want to share and have some discussion about what I think are some of the key gleanings from the Old Testament if you were to try to develop some sort of a radar for idols based on the different passages we've seen. And we can chat about that. So the first is, as I mentioned, idolatry is about misplaced loyalty. We didn't have too much time to talk about the prophets, but if you recall, the book of Hosea and actually a number of prophetic books have something called the marriage metaphor that describes adultery. So in this conceptual world, Yahweh is the faithful husband. Israel is envisioned as an adulterous wife. If you remember, the prophet Hosea is commanded to go marry an adulterous woman, Gomer, as a means of figuring the idolatry that has taken place. There's a lot of interesting receptions of that metaphor and interesting ethical questions with that. All I'll say is just remember that this was written to a male religious elite. So the male religious elite is being equated with the adulterous wife, not women in Israel. But the point of, I think, using these metaphors of adultery or political treason to discuss what happens in idolatry is that idolatry is fundamentally about loyalty to a specific goal or person. And so I mentioned the marriage metaphor, but elsewhere in Hosea and in the prophets, things that get mapped onto idolatry are trust in political alliances. So in particular, the Northern Kingdom, which we already know is bad news. The reason that they were bad a lot of the time is that they were making treaties with Assyria and Egypt in ways that forced, according to the biblical authors, them to compromise their value of Yahweh alone. So part because we talked as well about political power and theology being so closely linked, what the authors of Scripture often see going on in the North is there's a desire for protection, and they're looking not to Yahweh for that protection, but to political authorities, and therefore forcing them to make certain compromises about things that ordinarily would not be done in the name of Yahweh. I don't know if you can think about any modern day parallels to that. I'll leave that to you. I want to share a very interesting study that comments on some of these themes. So there was a 2010 study published in the Journal of Marketing Science, which looked at and found a correlation between a person's level of religiosity and their preference for brand name products. So it's very interesting. What they found is the more religious a person was, the less likely they were to prefer brand name products. And so they were more comfortable with sort of generic products if they had a religious identity. And the correlation was even more pronounced when it came to what they called identity marking objects. So sunglasses, watches, and socks, things that other people would see you wear. You tend to care more about those being brand name if you are less connected to a religious community. That was just what they found in general. There's a lot of interesting things we could maybe conclude from that. But what the research has concluded is that there's some sort of power that religious identities have in relativizing other identities. So it's less important to have secondary identities if you have a primary religious identity. So what I take from that is that fundamental human need to be loyal to something other than oneself, and whether that is a brand, whether that is a party, whether that is a theological community, whatever it is, there is a need for loyalty and belonging in that community. Any reflections or thoughts about that?
No, to me, sports seems a more apt thing than
Yes.
shopping.
We're
As far
celebrities.
as loyalty.
That's a very good point.
Celebrities too, you're right.
Yeah.
But I mean, in the South, this whole thing about, like, I know UGA fans that didn't go to UGA. I mean, just have this identity. I'm not sure
Right.
how it relates to religiosity or not.
That would be a really interesting study. To what extent does religious identity relativize sports identity? Because that's very true. I mean, I'm sure we've all observed that anecdotally just around us in the air. Yeah? Any other thoughts on that? Yes.
I was thinking, sometimes when we're religious, you're saying religious, people get loyalties to the religion brand names. Oh, I'm a Baptist. Oh, I'm a Episcopalian. And is that a form of, is that true religion or is that a brand name thing?
That's very interesting. I need to think about that. Yeah, I'm certain that denominations can be interacted with in that way as sort of brands. And I think one of the things we saw in the stories of the Old Testament, something that is an idol for one person might not necessarily be an idol for another person. And it's more in terms of how that love or affection for that thing ranks in your own heart and mind and why. So thank you.
I was a little fascinated with the idea that religious people didn't care about the brand name as much, and just thinking that maybe that's a way of discerning what the real character of something is, you know. That's what you're trying to do in your religious life, and maybe the discernment is kind of like, well, this is made in the same factory as that, and it's, you know, I don't know, it's a thought that came up.
Sure, maybe a heightened perception of...
Heightened perception of,
Yeah.
of the authenticity of what you're getting.
Like at the end of the day, there's not that big a difference between real like Ray-Bans and just your generic. I mean, I don't know, maybe there is. I'm not a sunglasses gal. Maybe some of y'all can fight me on that. But that's a good point. I think in general, there's that attempt to discern. Yes.
What about loyalty to a particular priest or rabbi that leads to splitting and sects and
Yes.
different sects and the follow, you know, what's being worshipped here?
Yes, and yeah, we know plenty about that in Protestantism as well, of all of these different, divisions upon divisions. And it also makes me think of passages in Paul in the New Testament where, I think it's 1 Corinthians, but he's saying like, you say, I follow Peter, I follow James, I follow Jesus, just follow Jesus kind of thing. And these particular leaders that become more than just leaders, really, sort of objects of worship in their own right. And so I think there seems to be innumerable cases in which something, whether a person or an ideology, can be the object of loyalty. That is really, that person is meant to be a conduit, right, at the end of the day.
And sometimes with regard to churches, that's just the result of an honest interaction with texts and with the style of worship that you feel called to. And, you know, I mean, yeah, I know, you know, one church and all of that, but, you know, it seems like if God had really wanted that, he would have given us a brain that interpreted scripture all the same way. That doesn't happen that way, so.
True, yeah, you can't really give us something like the biblical text and expect there to be one. Sure, and I actually do agree with you. I think that it is, in the general sense, I don't think denominations are a bad thing, right? I think God meets us where we're at in a lot of ways, and styles of worship and sort of that sort of thing. I want to get to our second point, idolatry in the Old Testament. I think that idolatry, wherever it happens, reverses the relationship between creator and creature, right? Us as humans are creatures. God is creator. Does anybody else love Eugene Peterson? Yeah? Christ Plays in 10,000 Places? Yeah, I knew Carmen would be nodding. So you should read everything by him. But he has this quote. He says, an idol is a god with all the God taken out. The idol reverses the God-creature relationship. Now I am the God, the idol is the creature. A lot of the texts that I work in with my dissertation are called the anti-idol polemics. That's these sections you've probably read in Isaiah or in the Psalms or in Habakkuk, where not only are idols being denigrated, they're actually being ridiculed. It's like What, you think you cut down a tree, you have dinner on one by burning the wood of one half of it, and then you bow down to the other half of it? Like, you're dumb, okay? Which, it's interesting to compare these different sets of texts and what it is in particular that they find so abhorrent and ridiculous about these practices. So there's a number of different texts. I'll just suffice it to say what they're attacking is the sensory capacity of the images. So while you think God should be able to smell, to walk around, to see and hear, these material objects cannot do any of those things, right? Bel and Nebo, these Mesopotamian gods, they have to be carried. They cannot carry you, as 2nd Isaiah would say. And the fact also that mere humans constructed these. So why is this such a problem for the prophetic authors? So I've hinted at this a few times as we've talked about the idea of the image of God in Genesis, but I want to kind of connect these two things because I really think in the mind of many biblical authors, they are connected. So in Genesis, at the end of creation, when God makes humanity, what God says is, let us make humans in our tselem, in our image. I want you to go all the way back to our first day of speaking about P and Mesopotamian consecration ceremonies. This Hebrew word tselem is a cognate with the Akkadian salmu. It's the exact same word that is used to describe divine images that would go through rites of consecration and animation in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, elsewhere. So what I think, and other scholars think that is actually communicating, is rather radical, that is saying the reason that humans cannot be authorized to produce divine images is because humans are the divine image for Yahweh. And thus, when we attempt to become creators in our own right, it's a failure of our vocation, because we are not meant to create, but to rather be. But also remember, the Mesopotamians don't think these images are merely pointing to God, as in sort of a reminder that God exists. They, in fact, are carrying forth the essence of God. The divine images do the same things that the gods in themselves do. And so what I think is so genius about the biblical authors is they're taking this conceptual world in which divine images of wood and stone exist and are in a real kind of ontological communion with the deity, and they're saying, that's right, there are images that are carrying forth God into the world, but they're not made of wood and stone, they're made of flesh and bone. And that's what humans are to the deity. And so I think there's a way that we can read a lot of these prophetic texts that seem on the one hand very negative towards you can't worship these gods, XYZ. And we don't, I think, need to interpret that as necessarily a xenophobic reaction to other people's religious practice. I think there's a way to interpret it as we actually, as maybe 2nd Isaiah saying, I actually agree that God is present in the world in the way that you think, but it's actually through human beings rather than sort of wood and stone. And that's the reason why humans can't do that on their own. Questions or thoughts?
That reminds me of the scripture that whenever you did this to the least of these, you did it to me.
Yes.
God is present in human beings.
I love that. I heard a really, really good sermon on that passage a few weeks ago, and the pastor was saying, it was sort of about how we serve the least of these, and it was like, look, this isn't meant to be sort of a white savior complex. You go out and save these people and give them what you have and you're the powerful one. It's you need to go out and meet Jesus in these people. Like that's where Jesus is. Jesus is not with you necessarily. You need to go out and see Jesus and he's told you where he is. And so I like the connection to that. Yeah, thank you.
Well, the early, in 12-step programs, you know, the early steps are there is a God and it's not me.
It's interesting how that's actually therapeutic, right? It's not merely assenting to some like abstract truth, right? Yes, please.
Yeah, well, I love what Adam Hamilton says. He says, when God moves, God sends people. Because I think I
Right.
particularly get discouraged with people who, because they happen to be at the right place at the right time, they believe God particularly saved them. And so I love that image. And also then, we need to listen to those little tweaks that we get in terms of moves that we should be making, not knowing necessarily at that point that God intended it.
Right. Yeah. How does it change the way that we view other people and ourselves if what you have is not just signs pointing to God, but statues of God all around us? You know, that really changes the way I think that we interact with other people. Third point, because we're coming up on time, is that idolatries multiply. And so you see this throughout the prophets as well. Rarely do you see a prophet point out only political idolatry as a problem. Almost every time, if there is an issue of political idolatry, the prophet traces it to a fundamental failure to care for the poor in the midst of Israel. And so the idea that you are, in general, biblical authors aren't just mad because people are, quote, worshiping Baal. They connect it with, this is all part of a system of values that Yahweh rejects, where the rich are entitled to more than the poor. There is more hierarchical division in society, and that is kind of, maybe rightly or wrongly, wrapped up in the vision of worshiping a different God. And so naturally, there's not just one idol that one follows during times of idolatry. They sort of lead one into the other. And so a very clear place we see this is in Micah 6. You probably know Micah 6:8. What does the Lord require of you? To act justly, love mercy, the summation, right, of the Christian way. So what Micah says after that, though, I want to read to you. He says, shall I acquit someone with dishonest scales, with a bag of false weights? You rich people are violent, your inhabitants are liars, and their tongues speak deceitfully. You have observed the statutes of Omri and all the practices of Ahab's house. You have followed their traditions. Therefore, I will give you over to ruin and your people to derision. You will be the scorn of the nations. Now, we spoke a little bit about Ahab and the house of Omri. These are northern kings, known in particular for their friendliness with Phoenicia, which means their friendliness with Baal. And so what Micah is doing here is connecting that with the oppression of the poor that is happening in 8th century Judah. And so for him, these are not two separate things. It's not like just a religious problem that you're worshiping this God. This is something that's going to have implications for how you treat people in your own society. So I think that's a point worth bringing forward in our own world as well. Thoughts about that? I want to share a quick, well, maybe not that quick, quote from a book that I would also recommend called Gods That Fail by Vinod Ramachandra. He tries to bring this idea more grounded in our current context in actually a way that relates to sports, as we spoke. He says, idolatries feed on one another. Nationalism and the cult of violent revolution have often bred together. Today, in events such as the Olympics or the World Cups in football and cricket, mammon, nationalism, and the idolatry of sport reinforce each other in global competition. Impoverished majority world countries spend lavish funds on the construction of showpiece stadiums and the hosting of international contests. It is the usual practice for the police and city officials to sweep away beggars and shanty towns in the local environs so that an image of respectability could be projected on TV screens around the world. The shanty towns return once the cameras move away. So it's amazing how similar a lot of this sounds actually to Micah 6, these interlocking senses of idolatry. Finally, fourth and finally, we aren't great at seeing our own idols. People in the Old Testament do not set out to worship idols. This is maybe an obvious thing, but it bears repeating. Jeroboam did not seek out to do actions that would be considered unorthodox or Yahwistic or un-Yahwistic, because people generally don't do that, right? People are generally following their own sense of values that feel right to them, that they feel God has communicated to them. And so I think that should be a really humbling reality to us in saying, probably it's more difficult for you to identify your own idols than it is for you to identify the idols of somebody you totally disagree with. And probably that person you completely disagree with has the clearest view to your own idols. And that's a hard reality. But I think that's what's true from the pages of the Old Testament. So how do we figure out our own idols? This is the closest you're going to get to a test. What is the set of values communicated by this thing, this person, this ideology, this denomination? And what are the rituals and sacrifices required for this thing's sustenance? Because that's what we find over and over again, whether we're talking about worship of Baal in the ancient world, use of Asherah poles, use of the Nehushtan, things that change in their status throughout the biblical period, as well as things like nationalism, sport, mammon that we heard about in the last slide. These are not unembedded realities. Any object that becomes an idol does so in a particular context and has particular values that it communicates and particular rituals that are required for its sustenance. So rather than tell you, these are your idols, I submit these questions to you, recognizing that I think in all of our lives, this is shifting. Definitions of idolatry for one person may be different from another person, but I think these questions can help us get thinking in the ways that the biblical authors who want us to smash our own idols as well as those in our communities. I think that's the sort of attitude that they would encourage us to have, is to be more focused on our own sort of value systems, so to have a clearer view to see others. So any thoughts sort of on that, maybe the last two elements I spoke about?
I wonder if anything that sort of denigrates or diminishes the poor is, that's kind of a good place to look for idols, it would seem to me.
Mm-hmm. It's very consistent with what we see in the biblical text. Whenever there is mistreatment of the poor, that seems to automatically warrant a claim of idolatry. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's so hard to avoid the tendency to go that way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we don't set out to dismiss the poor. Sometimes we celebrate being with each other, and maybe we think about the poor, but we just, we don't bring them in our midst. I mean, it's so slippery. There's so many slippery slopes.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. How complicit are we in systems that oppress?
Yeah.
And that's very hard work to parse all of that out. And I think there's lots more to be said about how that gets done. But I think the biblical authors would say that no matter how you go about it, that has to be part of your religious sort of orientation, part of your practice before God. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I appreciate the tie-in. I'm just thinking a lot about, as you said earlier, our consumer culture. And so thinking back to sort of the first image that you introduced and the connection between, what we pursue, and even if, the intent is not to harm the poor, if we're buying things and the creation of these things is exploiting people on the other side of the world that we're not thinking about, those choices, our choices are impacting other people. And there was a documentary about Walmart many years ago, but I think the title was something about like the high cost of low prices. And it was about how what we value and prioritize really does have an impact on.
Right, and a lot of that is out of the way of our eyes, of our awareness.
Exactly.
So that, that makes it easier for the powers that be to keep it out of their own greed, to keep all that going.
It's easier to not see it a lot of the time. Yeah. Yes.
I think it's important too, I'm assuming we're still trying to do that, in us figuring out what the poor need, rather than finding out what they think they need, or maybe some don't think they need anything, they're okay, or maybe some say, well, that's okay for you to do that, but that is not. And there again, we're putting it all poor in one pot.
Right.
And so, and it's probably very hard not to do that with any group, but because that leads to real trouble. But I do think the idea that we say, well, they're bound to need this, so we'll do this, and it's maybe not true.
There's a lot of
It was
power.
true 20 years ago, but it surely is not now.
Yeah.
We get embroiled.
That's funny, thinking about the Thanksgiving at home,
Right.
there's 100 people, 100 different personalities in those homes that we're going to give those same things to. Which, I mean, it's nice because it's even, but it's to think about everyone has their own picture of what it is they need next. That's really hard. It's-
Well, these are conversations worth continuing, and I hope that we'll continue to mull over that in the coming weeks. But we're at time. I just want to say thank you all so much for welcoming me in these past few weeks and engaging in such great discussion. I've learned a lot from the things that you all have brought up, and so I'm grateful for that. So with that, we'll be dismissed. Thank you.
Caitlin, this has just been a real gift, and I am so grateful for the fact that one of these days you'll be working in some elite institution, and we can say we knew her when she was working on that doctorate, and I think you've just given us so much to think about, and I appreciate the fact that you have been able to marry this scholarship and these biblical themes with enough humor to help us be able to lower our own sort of resistance. But I think that is disarming in a way that's really helpful, because I think as a person who walks around with all kind of planks in her own eyes, it's just grateful to have someone like you leading us and helping us to just see more clearly the things that are in front of us. So I'm so grateful for your sharing your gifts with us during this time and in this way. And I do hope that these are conversations will continue. This is our work to do, and we've had a great guide sort of bring us to the beginning of the path. And I hope that we'll continue to journey together. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Charlie.
This has been great.
Thank you.
What is the title of your dissertation?
Oh, you can't ask me that. No, it's Deutero-Isaiah's Aniconic Logic, Divine Ontology, and the Image Fabrication Parodies. That's the current title. I'm thinking about changing it, but yeah, thank you. Yeah, look out for that.